and I still don't get it. I've heard the illustrations that are supposed to help us, and to some degree, I guess they do. Things like water can be found in three forms. It can be a liquid, or it can be steam, or it can be ice. And I get that, 3 in 1. And there's a 3-leaf clover, all of them coming off of the same stem, and I get that too. And there's the idea of a chord with 3 notes. It's still just one chord. I'm talking about a musical chord there. And an egg has a shell, and it's got a yolk, and it's got the white, and yet it's one egg. And those are kind of helpful, but it still leaves me with a mystery. And so I can really relate to Karl Barth, the famous theologian from the 20th century, who toward the end of his life once wrote, "The angels are laughing at old Karl Barth for trying to grasp God." And I think we all need to have that kind of humility when it comes to our trying to understand the mystery of who God is. And so this week and next, as we're looking at the names of Jesus, we're exploring a mystery. Because this week we're going to talk about Jesus as the Son of God. And next week we're going to be talking about Jesus as the Son of Man. And there's a mystery there, isn't there? And there's lots of scripture I'm going to be sharing today. I've got to be moving fast, all right? So if you're one of those note takers, and I love note takers, but just jot down the scriptures. I'm going to put as many of them as I possibly could. Well, I guess I could have put them all up here, but most of them are going to be on the screen for you, but I've got to move fast today. So human society will tolerate some pretty outrageous claims. But when it comes to claiming deity, that's where you kind of cross the line. And we've seen that in our own lifetimes. We've seen people who claim that they're the Messiah, they claim that they're God, and we've seen the way that's received. And so take that thought and go back in history, because that makes the historical growth of Christianity all the more remarkable. In the beginning, Christianity was seen pretty much as a Jewish cult. But the followers of Jesus entered into that Greek world, that Roman world, claiming that a carpenter from Galilee who had been crucified by Pontius Pilate was the Son of God. And they didn't back down from those claims, no matter how they were received. In fact, it soon became the essential confessional term for becoming a follower, for becoming a disciple, was to confess with your lips, Jesus Christ is the Son of God. This was and is the basic gospel. And so Mark, the most basic of the 4 gospel narratives, begins his gospel with these words: the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, at the end of John's gospel, John tells us, I've told you all of this, and I'm only touching the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more I'd like to say to you, but if I did, there wouldn't be enough books in the world to hold everything. And then he says this, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Actually, as you read through John's gospel, he shows evidence of people coming to this conclusion. It begins in chapter 1 with John the Baptizer. John the Baptizer, John chapter 1 and verse 34 says, Some translations have it differently, but he says, I have seen and I testify that this is the Son of God. And just a few verses later, Nathanael says this. I'm sorry, it's not Nathanael. Yeah, it is. Chapter 1 and verse 49. He says, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. But John's fair, because he doesn't just tell us about people who come to that conclusion. He tells us about people who didn't come to that conclusion too. In chapter 5, Jesus has healed a lame man. And he heals the lame man on the Sabbath. And as a result of that, the religious leaders become pretty upset with him. And so Jesus begins explaining to them why he has the authority to heal on the Sabbath, which just makes them all the more angry with him. And so in chapter 5 and verse 18 it says, for this reason they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. And eventually they have Jesus arrested. They're wanting to kill him. And so the religious leaders come before Pontius Pilate and they say to him in John 19 and verse 7, we have a law, and according to that law he must die because, why? He claimed to be the Son of God. And so John has this question all the way through his gospel that he wants his reader to wrestle with. And it's this: is Jesus the Son of God? And that's a question that every potential convert has to answer. John would later write in 1 John chapter 5 and verse 5, who is it that overcomes the world? Only the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, since this idea of Son of God is so prevalent in the New Testament, I want to, and again, I'm running fast, but I want to just keep it to the Gospel of Matthew pretty much for the rest of our study today. In Matthew's gospel, we know Matthew was a Jew. He's basically writing to Jewish people. And so Matthew begins his gospel by showing us that Jesus' sonship was affirmed by heaven. And not just once, but twice. God speaks not through others about Jesus. God himself speaks twice in the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew chapter 3, Jesus has just been baptized. He says he was baptized to fulfill all righteousness. And then in verse 16 it says, as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, this is my Son, whom I love. With him I'm well pleased. And so Jesus of Nazareth received the Father's own words of commendation and the Father's own words of recommendation. Someone at this point might say, well, aren't we all children of God? And to some degree that's true. But the relationship that Jesus had with the Father was unique. In fact, in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 27, he said, all things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. And so John has this word that he uses on a number of occasions for Jesus, the Son of God. It's the word monogenes in Greek. It's a compound word, and it's an important word. It's found in John chapter 1 and verse 18, where John says, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only God, That word in English, four words, one and only, no, that's 3 words. I'm sorry, I got to learn to count again. One and only, that's the word monogenes. And then he uses it again in the verse we all know, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. One and only. I think a better translation might be unique. Very literal, it is a compound word in Greek, but I bet you can recognize the 2 parts. Mono means what? One. Genes means kind. Literally, one of a kind. He is the one of a kind Son. There's not another one like him. The King James Version, I'm sorry for those of you who love the King James Version, it's got some problems just like every translation. It didn't do us any favors here by translating this begotten, because that's not what the word means. And it's linked to a number of problems because begotten suggests that the Father existed before the Son. And yet, Scripture makes it very clear to us that Jesus was with the Father when? In the beginning. He's always been. So, Jesus' sonship is unlike any other. We can claim to be children of God, but we claim to be children of God through adoption as his children. But Jesus' sonship is on the basis of his eternal nature. He always was, he always is, and he always will be. And so Matthew's first incident was at a river at Jesus' baptism. The second one comes in Matthew chapter 17 on a mountain. Jesus went up on the mountain to pray. He takes with him 3 of his apostles. And he is transfigured there on that mountain. Today we might say he was morphed. What they saw on that mountain was Jesus as he looked in his pre-flesh nature. And appearing with him are Moses and Elijah. Now, Peter's overwhelmed with it. And so, in line with what Rod said today, Peter says, let's build a monument. And while he is still speaking, it says, chapter 17 and verse 5, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. We just heard that a while ago, didn't we? Back in chapter 3. But then he adds these words. Listen to him. Why? Because he's more than Moses the lawgiver, and he's more than Elijah a prophet. He is my Son. He is my one-of-a-kind Son. John 16 and verse 9 says, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. And so back in 1936, there was going to be a radio address from England that was broadcast in the United States. King Edward VIII was going to speak. But moments before it was time for him to speak, someone tripped over the cable and it snapped in two. But there was a quick-thinking apprentice who jumped down and grabbed both ends of the cable, and his body literally became the conduit through which the words of the king were broadcast. That's what God was saying on this mountain. Through my Son, my words will be communicated to the world. And it is a powerful testimony about who God says Jesus is. And you know what? What God says about Jesus ought to be enough. But Matthew offers us more evidence. There are at least 4 additional witnesses to Jesus' identity in the Gospel of Matthew, and the first one's going to surprise you. Hell. Hell is the first one. Interesting, We humans continually want to debate about the identity of Jesus. You can look at your TV schedule just about every day at the History Channel or at the National Geographic Channel, and you're going to see some show that's talking about the identity of Jesus in some way. And so we humans love to do that. We like to debate his identity. But let me tell you something. There has never been a debate in hell about who Jesus is. After his baptism, Matthew chapter 4, in verse 3, he goes out into the wilderness where he's tempted by Satan. And listen to two things that the deceiver says to him. It says in verse 3, the tempter came to him and said, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. And in verse 6, the second temptation, if you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down. That word if really ought to be since right there. Since you are the Son of God. Satan's trying to get Jesus not to prove that he's the Son of God. Satan already believes that. Satan's trying to get Jesus to work outside of his mission. Satan's trying to get Jesus to take advantage of his privileges, to take advantage of his position. Satan knew exactly who he was dealing with. And so did his minions. Look at chapter 8, verse 28. When he arrived at the other side in the region of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. What do you want with us, Son of God? They shouted. Have you come to torture us before the appointed time? Now, I'm wondering if it's incidences like this one that would have led Jesus' half-brother James to write in James chapter 1 and chapter 2 and verse 19, even the demons believe and shudder. By the way, Jesus always declined demonic testimony, but Jesus never denied it. He would silence the demons, but he never corrected them. He never said, you've got the wrong guy. And so Matthew goes on record as saying that even hell believes that Jesus is the Son of God. Second witness to Jesus being the Son of God is his disciples. Now, admittedly, it takes them longer to catch on than it did the demons. But there was a particular incident in Matthew chapter 14 that made quite an impression on them. It was a night when the mystery of Jesus began to be made clearer to them. Jesus had sent them in a boat across the Sea of Galilee, and he stayed behind to pray. And a storm came up on the lake, and the disciples were scared, and here comes Jesus walking on the water toward them. And they saw him, and their first thought is, he's a ghost. But then he identified himself. And when he identified himself, Peter then said, if it's you, let me come out to you on the water. And Jesus said, come on. I bet Peter wasn't expecting that answer. But he does it. He gets out and he begins to walk on the water. And you know the rest of the story. He becomes afraid. He begins to sink. Jesus rescues him. They get back in the boat. And the moment they step back into the boat, the sea's calm. And that night changed their lives, because look what it says in verse 33. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. Now listen. If Jesus is the Son of God, then worship is the appropriate response. But there are many people who come up short here. Muslims, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, they will say some really nice things about Jesus. They will say that Jesus was a great prophet. They will say all kinds of flattering things about how he was a powerful angel or a great teacher or a noble martyr. but they won't go this far. Don't make us worship him. And so Matthew 16, Jesus and the disciples went to Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus asked them, hey, what's the word on the street about me? And they gave some flattering responses. They said, well, Jesus, there's comparisons to you and John the Baptist and Jeremiah and Elijah and other of the prophets. And Jesus said, that's great, but hey, what do you guys say about me? And you know, we pick on Peter a lot. We pick on him when we don't realize he's probably more like us than any of the other apostles. And let's give him credit, though. He had some good moments, too. And here's one of them, because in verse 16 he said, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. That's an important moment. And I want you to recognize this. It is not just enough to not have a bad word about Jesus. It is important that we have the right word about Jesus. And so the third witness of Jesus as the Son of God is Jesus himself. Now there's liberal theologians today who will tell you that Jesus never made any claims to be deity. I'll tell you right now, they're reading a different Bible than I do. Because the Gospels are full of examples of Jesus claiming to be deity. And here's proof that that's what he was doing, is the people of his day understood that. It wasn't some brainy guy in some institution that was saying, oh, he's not really claiming to be deity here. They understood him to be claiming to be deity. Let me give you a good example of that in John chapter 8. By the way, I'm not picking on academic people either. I mean, that can be a good thing. John chapter 8 and verse 58. Jesus said, very truly I tell you, before Abraham was born, I am. And every one of them understood exactly what he was saying. Because it says at this, they picked up stones to stone him. Why? Because they understood him to be blaspheming in their mind, claiming to be God. In John chapter 10 and verse 30, Jesus said, I and the Father are one. In fact, it is Jesus' claims to be deity that make him enemies. In fact, it is Jesus' claims to be deity that leads to his death. Matthew chapter 26, Jesus has been arrested by Jewish officials, and in their legal system, there had to be more than 2 witnesses in order to have a conviction. And you know what? They're doing such a poor job at this shoddy case that they're bringing against Jesus, they can't even find 3 witnesses. And their case is falling apart, and Caiaphas, who is the high priest, becomes desperate, and so he sees things aren't going well, and so he makes a bold move, and he tries to make Jesus the 3rd witness. And so here's what happens, Matthew 26 and verse 62. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And brothers and sisters, let me tell you, right here at this specific moment, Jesus signs his death warrant. Because in verse 64 he says, you have said so. But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and see, he understood. He tore his clothes and said, he has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Now here's the irony. The opponents of Jesus concluded that his death disproved his claims. In fact, they turn all this against him. They taunt him when he's on the cross. Look at verse 39. They taunt him with his claims. Matthew 27:39. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. He saved others. They said, but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross and we'll believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants to. For he said, "I'm the Son of God." You see, this proved to them that Jesus was a fraud. And I want you to think about how much of a temptation it must have been to Jesus as he was hanging on the cross to just come right down. He's got people spitting at him. He's got people taunting him. He's got people making these kinds of accusations. There must have been a great temptation to say, "I'll show them." And catch this. His enemies refused to bow down to him because he would not come down from the cross. And you and I today bow down to him because he didn't. So, with all of their hate and with all of their taunting, the last words from Jesus' lips on the cross are, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And so the fourth witness to Jesus as the Son of God is the cross. You see, killing Jesus didn't stop the message. In fact, killing Jesus became an essential ingredient to the message. In Matthew 27 and verse 54, it says, "When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, 'Surely he was the Son of God.'" Now this is a Roman centurion. He's a Gentile. And yet there is some recognition on his part. It's not a perfect recognition, but some recognition on his part that this Jesus was the Son of God. And I would suggest to you, even if he didn't have all his theology right, he was starting at the right place. The place to begin to explore who Jesus is at the cross. And so there's some things that you and I need to know as we explore who Jesus is. And one of them is that we need to know how much Jesus means to God. Now the thunder from heaven should have made that pretty clear. And God only speaks 2 times in Matthew's gospel. And in both of those accounts, God says, "I love my Son." And Jesus said in John 17 and verse 24, "Father, I want those you have given me to be with me where I am and to see my glory, the glory you have given me because you loved me before the creation of the world." God's love for his Son makes the gift of his Son all the more amazing, doesn't it? Second thing we need to know is that Jesus is the best God has to offer. Jesus is his one and only Son. Jesus is his one-of-a-kind Son. Jesus is his unique Son. He once told a parable that illustrated this, a parable about a man who owned a vineyard. He had planted a vineyard, and he left it in the hands of his hired hands, and he left. Well, when it came harvest time, he sent a servant back to get some of the return from the harvest, and they beat that servant. So he sent another servant, and they beat him. He sent another servant, and they killed him. And so this father, I can't imagine why he said this. I have nowhere to put this. But the father reasoned, "I'll send my son because they'll respect him." And he sends his son. And they kill him too. He sent his very best. God sent his very best. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 9 says, "This is how God shows his love among us. He sent His one and only Son into the world that we might live through Him. Third point, God has acted in history to validate Jesus' claims. And He's done this in a number of ways. He did it through the miracles. He's done it through His Word. God could have sent 10,000 angels to take Jesus off the cross, to deliver Him. But if God had saved His Son, then He couldn't save you and me. And so Paul begins his great letter to the Romans with these words. Romans chapter 1. Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God, the gospel He promised beforehand through His prophets in the Holy Scriptures, regarding His Son, who as to His earthly life was a descendant of David, and who through the Spirit of holiness was appointed the Son of God in power by His resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Let me tell you, the empty tomb is still God's greatest validation of Jesus Christ, His Son. Fourth, recognizing Jesus' sonship is the key to realizing ours. Now, this is going to seem so obvious that you might wonder why I'm saying it. Yet in our times, I think this needs to be said. You can't be a Christian if you are unsure about Jesus Christ. Now, there are things that we can disagree about. There are things that we may not get right. But that's not one of them. There is one way to the Father, and it is through His Son. In Acts 9, Saul, who would soon be Paul, was converted. And it says in Acts chapter 9 and verse 20, at once he began to preach in the synagogues. Now he's telling Jewish people this, Jesus is the Son of God. It matters. Because it's our recognition of His status as Son that makes our adoption as children possible. John put it this way in John chapter 1 and verse 11. He came to that which was His own, but His own did not receive Him. Yet to all who did receive Him, to those who believed in His name, He gave the right to become children of God.